So I'm interested, and I'm going to be talking about how does society as a system think, and in particular, more specifically, how does science as a system think. I'm James Evans. I'm in the sociology department. I'm also a senior fellow here at the Computation Institute and run an organization called Knowledge Lab. So I'm going to start talking a little bit about Knowledge Lab and what it is that we're hoping to accomplish with it. In some sense, we're really trying to understand scientific knowledge, but also in some ways, this is a model for knowledge in general. So really the mandate of this center is the idea that there's this explosion of digital information of all types, and that this really represents an unprecedented opportunity to study a whole host of dynamics that shape human understanding, investigation, certainty, or dubiousness, etc. Right? So the whole idea is that we kind of, one, try to efficiently harvest and share knowledge and judgment from a host of sources, right? Experts, people of all kinds, extract information from articles, preprints, software as a kind of a trace of knowledge, patient records, artifacts of a variety of types, including machines, computing machines, videos, sensors, etc. And also using creative crowdsourcing approaches to kind of leverage these to kind of create smart surveys and things that are able to extract and gather information from these different sources. Two, to learn how knowledge is made, where it comes from, how it's certified, how it's forgotten or remembered. Third is to kind of represent, recombine, and generate knowledge in powerful ways, ideally to kind of take into account some of these provenance issues. Right? So one can identify with some certainty bias of some kind, right, that limits the efficiency of creativity. Then can one essentially design systems that take this into account and ask questions that accommodate that? And then can one do this in discovery platforms where these hypotheses are actually asked as ex-ante experiments, and that essentially relative discovery rate or fruitfulness of discovery rate ends up kind of feeding back to the deeper validation that you actually understood something in the first place about the problems that you overcame with these proposals. And then finally, to kind of just to take these intuitions to improve knowledge generation, representation, management, innovation practices in a whole host of organizations. So we're interested in lots of different data types, but the one that we spend perhaps the most time on is additionally this corpus of scientific articles, and this is kind of what it looks like. It's just an enormous stack of papers. It kind of looks the same way on a computer, right? You've got this huge XML files, and sometimes blobs with images, completely disorganized. Not completely, right? We understand that there are tags of various types, and these tags inform and allow us to read things that are relevant to our interests, right? So we look at things maybe that are more recent than more distant into the receding past. We look at things that are tagged by journals which are close to our substantive interests, and also kind of a high enough status that we expect some vetting of quality. So that indexes these things coarsely. But our hope with Knowledge Lab is to kind of extract this information and create this massive knowledge graph, knowledge web. So these papers represent a whole host of things, right? This is an artifact stack that represents their persons, there's technologies, there's money flowing into the research behind these papers, there's statistical tests and inference, there are modes of expression, there's metaphor. People are trying to make claims, at the end of papers. They're trying to kind of blow them up in their conclusions. They're trying to symbolically and strategically place their work in the context of references at the end of these papers. So there's people, there's concepts, there's methods and techniques. There's a whole host of things. There's a universe of systematic things and processes going on that this kind of deep permafrost of scientific articles can reveal if one, what I call kind of soft wires them, right? So if you wire together all of the authors and you kind of disambiguate who they are and where they are institutionally over time, with the money that was attached to their work. If you extract the techniques and the methods and concepts and the kind of phenomena that are being analyzed, if you link these things together, for example, synonymous phrases, you kind of push these together in ways that you can kind of inference or make inferences across disparate knowledge domains or knowledge cultures, then that allows you a lot of power to do a whole host of different things. So one thing that you can do, you can begin to do with this, is you can look at the impact of the context of knowledge creation on the content of that knowledge. And so you can look at the way in which the topology of the teams and collaboration networks that take on projects, institutional prestige, novel technologies, end up suggesting limitations or kind of habits of mind, if you will, that end up identifying areas in need of re-examination, that might identify things that you want to reweight former certainties. So there might be kind of information cascades where, based on very little or no experimental evidence, you have a whole host of convergence of people following kind of Bayesian updating based on the crowd, which is ultimately kind of resting on a very small or unknown empirical base. You can point out new paths that can cut across revealed assumptions, heuristics, and disciplinary boundaries, which typically kind of freeze things in. So here are a host of questions that folks in Knowledge Lab are working on. And who are the folks in Knowledge Lab? Right. So we've got a small group here. So we've got an executive director and a couple of postdocs. Welcome back from China, Bill. Got back yesterday. We've got some programmers, and then we're supporting a meta-knowledge research network, which is composed of roughly a third really creative computational scientists and modelers, and about 2/3 of domain scientists, from everything from ecology to cosmology and dense matter, who are interested in taking a long view of their fields, right? Identifying assumptions and habits of mind in their field, and then by taking those things into account, kind of creating new inferences. So some of the questions that we're interested in exploring are how science thinks, which is what I'm going to talk about as a system. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some recent findings in that space and some possibilities that we're playing with. Another is ambiguity in synonymy, the way in which one can use our understanding of what it is that things are referring to precisely or less precisely to kind of align them and do inference across much broader domains of research. Street scope project, so this is where we're taking street views from around the country and around the world to see how much knowledge essentially is inferable or viewable, both how much is possible, if you will, as a combination of both individual inferences, human inferences about what places look safer, what places look more wealthy, what places look more unequal, and also extracting objects from all these items to make inferences about between functions over those elements of those objects, and between human inference, you also have we have the underlying realities of safety and security of these places. So this is a project that kind of links in to Charlie's broader project, or the CCD. We're looking at the lives of concepts, how it is that concepts are born, live, grow, and die in the context of science, but also elsewhere. And of course, this involves not only analyses of just the conditions of growth, but also the fitness of these concepts in the context of an environment. There are certain environments that allow certain kinds of concepts in. There are niches that are more or less constrained. So understanding both the kind of the context of generation, the context of perception, ends up allowing them to gain some interesting inference about how these are systematically similar or different across fields of science, and also more other public domains like news and popular culture. We're trying to identify schools of thought. We have a project which looks at how economic incentives for economists end up shaping economic technologies or models over time, and the influence of that on field, some consulting opportunities, end up kind of shifting the field in interesting ways. We're looking at the impact of representations. So one can think about in kind of sociolinguistic universe the way in which language ends up coloring thought, shaping the speed at which certain kinds of things come to mind and other things are more difficult to conceive of. We're looking at this in the context of programming languages, which in some ways are equivalent, but they suggest different ways of solving problems. So we're creating some experimental sandboxes, as well in which people solve problems with different formalisms. And we're also exploiting the kind of large code repositories to look at how different structured formalisms and programming languages end up giving rise to certain kinds of problem solutions. We're looking at the way I call this project, the more we care, the less we know. So basically, contexts in which there boundaries, contestants to a war, end up shaping the certainty, basically, about certain other estimates that follow. So we're looking at, for example, the body count that comes out of natural disasters versus violent conflicts. In natural disasters, often there's a wide range of estimates that those come to converge over time as the official estimate is eventually kind of achieved, whereas in violent conflict, you often have, depending on the interests of the groups, different estimates, right, that converge separately and stay apart. And so the idea is often when we care the most about things, which is to say, when answers to certain questions resolve like large group problems and issues, it's often the most difficult to know. We're trying to kind of capture the bounds on that. We're looking at peer review. Actually, just this week we got a data set from the largest journal in the world, PLOS ONE, and their peer review activities. So like all the under the hood activity to kind of infer not only how like academic tribes and tribalism ends up shaping peer review, but how all kinds of possible bias end up shaping how it is that not only individuals, but the whole panel of individuals ends up shaping not only the success of the paper, but the likelihood that certain kind of novelty, creativity ends up kind of entering the corpus of science. We're looking at how news and events from the world end up filtering into things like science and social sciences and art, or how it is that internal concerns make it difficult for those events from the world to kind of permeate these things. We're looking at scientific accountability. Actually, just put in yesterday a grant to NSF, a humble prayer, that basically looks at ways of cutting up science in different ways. And there's 17 U.S. agencies which are exclusively devoted to funding basic science. There's no accountability mechanism. And the bins in which the basic research, both for government-funded science but also industry-funded science, are so antiquated that the stakeholders that actually populate these things don't themselves, they can't reproduce the survey they filled yesterday today. And so we're creating new ways using computational natural language processing, binning the science that's produced from the texts, from the grants, from papers to account for example, the topical landscape of science, as well as the kind of the process landscape of science. What are the mechanisms through which it's produced? We're interested in generating discovery systems, and we're generating hypotheses for a number of large-scale experiments, and in generating computational creativity, not just successful results, but interesting results that take into account our kind of inferred understanding of interestingness from the kind of the history of scientific productivity and awards. And we're also generating a bunch of tools along the way. So we're creating a high-performance knowledge base that includes this publication-related stuff, but other things. We're algorithms for reasoning over this thing, ways of allowing humans to annotate and learning, machine learning over those human annotations dynamically, creating intelligent surveys where when you ask people questions to get insight, that you're asking them only the questions that you don't know the answer to already or you can't predict the answer to. So maximizing both the information value and the surprisal of the responses of respondents to particular questions or moves in a kind of game that elicit insights or intuitions from scientists and others. And then creating and linking text, image, audio, signal, and sensor analysis pipelines. And the hope is that this kind of knowledge about knowledge can feed into a kind of a machine science or a machine-enabled science, right? So you can make a series of inferences that you can suggest these to researchers. In some cases, that you can in fact just create pipelines. Like this is Adam, Ross King's computational experimental setup that has a logic reasoner that's linked directly to a series of experiments that themselves feed the next sequence of experiments as a function of their success. Linking that with things like creativity and the reception of these findings by the community would really enable, in some sense, it pulls computation up the value chain of science. Right? If we're just analyzing data, it allows researchers to help ask the right questions. And in some sense, rather than designing just the right questions, they're designing the most fruitful algorithms to ask the right questions. So in my 5 minutes left, I'm just going to walk through a couple of cases that we've been playing with that take on this how does science as a system think. And this work was done with J.P. Foster, Andrei Krzyzewski, still here. So the question is kind of how, the first question I'm going to ask, this idea of how does science think is, well, how is it that scientists come up with the questions that they come up with? And I think I'm just going to whip through some of these slides, so forgive me for those who are here. I mean, we're taking a relatively impoverished view of scientists in this context. Scientists is following very simple rules, but even through the assemblage of those simple rules can create really interesting and complex structures. This is an ant colony that ants create. But sometimes I think, when we look at, this is the Wisconsin Institutes for Discovery, this is the Large Hadron Collider, this is the root system of the exceptional E8 group. I mean, sometimes we see these structures of science and it's hard to think that they're individual, very simple actions that may have created these simple things. And so I'm going to look, one study that we've done is we've looked at how it is that science searches through the space of possibilities and the efficiency of that search process. In this representation, we're basically taking chemicals that are used in a whole host of biomedical studies, about 10 million biomedical studies, and we're looking at how it is that scientists combine these things. So each paper, in some sense, in biomedicine that deals with therapeutics, or many that deal with analysis, almost all molecular biology papers, are dealing with chemicals, micro or small molecules or macromolecules in different ways. And these combine in ways that you can see traces, essentially, of the provenance, the kind of historical and national provenance of the participants. So what we find is that basically scientists combine things that are very central within this network. Surprise, surprise, like centrality in this case is defined by things that are connected to lots of other things, or popular things. But they don't connect things that are very distant in the network, and they almost never connect things that are disconnected in this network. It turns out if you look at those things that are given Nobel Prizes or prizes of any sort, they're much more likely to be more distant, they're much more likely to have a much more diverse degree distribution of those things, or popularity distribution of those things. So we built a simple model that we estimated the preferences, essentially, for searching for more or less central things, for more or less distant things. And what we found is that science, not surprisingly in some ways, is becoming more conservative over time. People are looking for more and more central things that are closer and closer together in this space. Then we take a sample, a large sample, and we identify, let's see, so this is these are the parameters estimated from the actual data over the course of millions of papers, right? So a preference for these very central nodes within the broader network of science. And this is averaged over thousands of runs, over 5,000 runs. And then we sweep the parameter space of this model to kind of explore, well, what happens if we discover what's been discovered in the most efficient way possible, given our very simple model space. Right? And so what we find is that this is the Medline, this is the efficiency of the Medline system. So this is kind of the rate of discovery per experiment. I'm sorry, this is the number of experiments per discovery. So it kind of goes up over the course of the saturation of the network that you're revealing. It's about the most efficient method that we could find in this model space for uncovering about 10% of the network, but it's unbelievably inefficient at discovering the whole network, even the whole network that it discovered. Right? There are much more efficient approaches to capture 20%, 50%, and 100% of this network. And these approaches all involve exactly the opposite of the historical trajectory of science as we've seen it. Right? It actually involves being very conservative at the beginning. So picking things that are very central at the very beginning and looking at their connections, their additional marginal connections to other things. And then becoming much more risky as the scientific system progresses. Right? So if one imagined, this was like the life course of an individual, rather than doing stuff that's really risky when you're in your teens, when you have all this enormous life to lose, you do like stable and safe things, and then when you're 80 and you've got 3 years left of life, that's when you want to paraglide, right? Because it's like it's just the right time. And that's and basically so this is and why is it? So we discover a whole host of possible strategies, more and less efficient ones. Why is this? Well, there are institutions of science that reward people for taking reasonable amounts of risk. Turns out these really efficient strategies end up, looking at very unlikely connections. So 1 in 10,000 of these experiments works, but when they work, it reintegrates, it rewires this whole system in a very dramatic way. Right? So if you've got an experimenter who has a budget of 10 experiments per year, then it's very difficult for them to essentially accommodate these highly risky strategies. You need new kinds of institutional structures. We also look at how basically publishing results, rather than just publishing positive results, which is the system now, if you actually publish negative results as well, what would that do for the efficiency of the discovery system of science over time? Even if you increase that slightly, you have dramatic, so this is the coordinated approach. If you took the approach as we take it, the Medline approach, it becomes, so this is a log scale, more than twice as efficient, even, not very far into the discovery process. And obviously the optimal coordinated results are dramatically more effective. Just one project I'm going to mention here that Bill Shee and I have been working on asked the question of, again, how does science think, not just what are their overall strategies and risk preferences, but how do they, what are the actual pathways that science follows to kind of come up with what it comes up with. And so we look at, in this case, we're looking at the Medline database. So we're looking at authors, and we're looking at chemicals, and we're looking at methods, and we're looking at diseases. So basically people, topics, and approaches, right? And it turns out that if you look at the things that are connected, most of the things are disconnected, but they're disconnected by not a long distance. They're disconnected by like a two-link walk. If you talk to one of the co-authors that you could find many of these other things. You could find many of the other topics. People study many other things in this system. We basically walk through these random hypergraph models where people and chemicals walk through them, the kind of the substrate of science, of published science, to kind of find what's published and investigated next, in the next period. And we discover a host of interesting things that I'm not really going to talk about because our time's up, but feel free to chat with me later. One thing that I think is really quite interesting is the way in which, in the early period of this system, this is people. So the probability of things connecting to other things through people, right? So you find your new chemicals or your new topics or your new methods by chatting with other people that you know. Whereas later in the system, you find new chemicals to connect with your problems, new methods to connect with your problems through the system, the published kind of atlas of methods and chemicals and what have you. One hypothesis that we're kind of interested in exploring is, does the change in this system, the change in kind of discovery through other people to discovery through these atlases of information, can that account for some of the increases in kind of conservatism that we see over time in the discovery of the space? So I'm not going to talk about any of these things. One question we pose is, well, how can one do these kinds of analyses, not just within biomedicine, but across areas? When you have the Tower of Babel, when people have all kinds of different languages, and we have ways of aligning these things. So we have essentially synonymy parsers that we've been playing with, and we assess ambiguity, which is very different. It's not just that you're aligning things, but things are fuzzier in certain fields. So this is the command used to use the lexicon in a much more flexible, metaphoric way than it's used. The natural language is used in biology, medicine, and chemistry. Aligning these things is not so easy. There are implications for all of this. I'm not going to talk about it. So how does science think? Well, it's stable, institutionally transmitted distribution of research habits. It's not particularly sensitive to changes in the possibility space. It's efficient for discovery of about 10% of what we know. It's much more efficient when failures are published. It changes its mind. So at least in biomedicine, really early on, it's first people discover new things through other people, and now it's through these kind of scientific maps. And methods that I'm sure you was finding end up being special connectors. So scientists are kind of one-trick ponies, and often they'll connect to other things through the methods that they use. There are policy implications, but what I hope to kind of convey is that by understanding more about our knowledge and how it is, the provenance of our knowledge, where it comes from, where it likely comes from, that we can kind of we can bring computation up the value chain and really use computation to kind of enable science and do some of the science that maybe could be done better and more reliably and systematically than we could do ourselves. So so that's it. I know our time is up, and I'm happy to take questions as folks are leaving.
How much do you think you can generalize those results looking at the biomedical sector to sort of science or knowledge at large? Because it seems like the incentives in biomedicine are perhaps a bit different, because your goal is to produce a patentable drug in a lot of cases. So it seems like, coming up with a really novel compound is great, but even better is coming up with a profitable compound, even if it happens to be quite similar to an existing compound. So, can you really extrapolate from biomedicine to...
Well, I mean, it seems like there's two parts to that question. The second part of the question was, we should give an example, is that there are different things that scientists and companies that are doing this research are optimizing. They're not just optimizing on discovery. They may be optimizing on actually working those discoveries into kind of reliable therapies, right? And that doesn't look like, in our little graph, I mean, if we're optimizing on discovery, that's not doing repeated research on the same classes of things. So there's a whole host of kind of objective criteria that you might want to optimize. And so one of the things that we're interested in doing is actually taking these families of criteria and inducing what it is that different classes of scientists and different organizations are in fact optimizing in practice over time. So here it's like a big modal story, like what's the most common thing that's going on? And it's pretty deep. I mean, like most institutions and people are kind of following these big trends. But then when you break them down, that's where it becomes interesting, and you can infer these tastes, preferences, and optimizations. So I think, in short, I think, I don't want to. Part of the purpose is to kind of discover difference. Which will necessarily. Any other questions for you?
I like the idea about looking at your failures. is there a central database where you can go to and people put out their experimentations that didn't meet the expectation of goals? So you can look at them and see if there's something that should go central, but you can look at stuff like that.
Well, I think, the U.S. government has tried to do this with clinicaltrials.gov. It's been, so for clinical experiments, it's been really quite unsuccessful so far. It's about, to my, I looked at this about a year and a half ago, about a 15% compliance rate, and the vast majority of that 15% were positive rather than negative findings. But there's a shift, a push towards kind of creating different kinds of systematic repositories. What's interesting is that organizations are much better at doing this than science as a whole, right? So you see organizations, pharmaceutical companies, creating internal databases of negative knowledge, of failing experiments, so they don't keep replicating these things ad nauseum. And so, so I think there's a number of different kinds of publication opportunities. Some of these are papers, some of these are kind of databases or knowledge bases that will be accessible to people. So yeah, I think there's a whole host of institutional possibilities that are starting to be taken out, and we're part of that conversation. So I'm gonna release people from the top. Thanks so much for coming, but I'll stick around if anyone has any questions.